I've wanted out for years, Elise. Did you really think some pictures would change that? My husband Richard sneered, tossing aside the anniversary photo album I'd spent months creating. He stood in our Seattle living room, designer luggage at his feet, already scrolling through his phone with disinterest. What Richard didn't know was that between those carefully arranged photographs lay something that would completely reverse our fortunes within the next hour. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I watched in silence as Richard flipped carelessly through the leather-bound album, bending the pages I had meticulously crafted over countless late nights. The soft leather cover, midnight blue with our initials embossed in silver, had been specially ordered from an artisan in Portland. Each photograph inside represented a milestone from our 15 years of marriage. Our wedding in the Cascade Mountains with Mount Rainier as our backdrop, the renovation of our first apartment in Capitol Hill, holidays with friends and family who'd slowly stopped calling as Richard's criticism of them increased year by year. The dim evening light filtered through our floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across our modern living room, a space I'd designed myself when my interior design business was still thriving. Before Richard had convinced me to take on fewer clients to focus on our life together. Before he'd started suggesting that perhaps my little hobby wasn't worth the effort anymore, 15 years reduced to this pathetic little scrapbook, he continued, dropping the album onto our glass coffee table with a thud that made me wince. I mean, seriously, Elise? This is what you've been hiding away doing all these months? No, wonder your design business is failing. His words stung with familiar precision. Richard had always known exactly where to aim his barbs. My business, my creativity, my sentimentality. Things he'd once claimed to love about me had gradually become targets for his derision. I'd watched it happen slowly, like water wearing a waystone, until I barely recognized the relationship we'd become. He gestured toward his expensive luggage by the door, the matching set of Toomey cases I'd bought him last Christmas after he'd hinted about them for months. $3,000 I'd taken from my dwindling business account because he'd mentioned how embarrassed he felt with his old luggage when traveling with colleagues. I'm not going to lie to you anymore, he said, straightening the cuff of his tailored shirt. Melanie and I are flying to New York tonight. She's been offered a position at Barrett & Hughes and I'm going with her. He paused, studying my face for a reaction. When I remained silent, he continued with increased intensity, as if my calmness was a challenge. She's young, ambitious, everything you used to be before you got comfortable and let yourself go. Melanie. His 29-year-old assistant with the marketing degree from Yale and the trust fund she pretended not to have. Of course. The late-night texts that made him smile in a way he no longer did with me. The weekend conferences that never seemed to generate any paperwork. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume, something with notes of jasmine and vanilla that clung to his shirts despite dry cleaning. I'd suspected for months but had stayed quiet, biding my time, watching, waiting for exactly this moment. I thought, we could handle this like adults, Richard continued, checking his watch. The Rolex Submariner I'd saved for an entire year to buy him for his 40th birthday. He'd worn it every day since, a constant reminder on his wrist of my devotion. My attorney will contact you about the house and investments. Try not to make this messier than it needs to be. The market's been good to us, but it won't cover your sentimentality. Our house in Queen Anne, the 1920s craftsman we'd spent 3 years renovating. The investment portfolio he'd insisted on managing himself despite my concerns about his risky strategies. The art collection we'd built together piece by piece. He was already dividing it all in his mind, calculating his share, determining what he could take and what he could leave behind. I remained seated on our custom Italian sofa, another of Richard's necessary purchases that had stretched our budget, smoothing the fabric of my dress. It was a simple blue wrap dress, one he'd always said made me look matronly and washed out. My hands trembled slightly, but not for the reason he assumed. "That's quite the speech," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Especially on our anniversary." Richard ran his hand through his salt and pepper hair, still thick at 45, and one of his points of pride. He'd been furious when I'd suggested he might be vain about it. "Anniversary?" he scoffed, his lips curling into that familiar smirk that once made my heart race but now made my stomach tighten. "You can't honestly tell me you thought we'd be celebrating? The dinner reservation at Louisa's? The new dress hanging in your closet I pretended not to notice? It's desperate, Elise." "You're desperate." Through the window behind him, I could see the Seattle skyline lit up against the darkening sky. 15 years ago, we'd stood together on the Space Needle observation deck, newly engaged, pointing out where we wanted to live someday. We'd both been graphic designers then, equals, before his career had accelerated, and mine had been quietly discouraged. I rose from the sofa, walking to where he stood. With careful movements, I picked up the photo album he had tossed aside so carelessly. The weight of it felt significant in my hands. "You're right about one thing, Richard," I said, cradling the album against my chest. "Tonight isn't going according to plan." He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my composure. He'd expected tears, perhaps pleading, the emotional outburst he could use later to paint me as unstable, irrational, exactly the kind of woman a man would naturally want to leave. What Richard didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know, was that nestled between those carefully selected photographs lay the key to my future and the end of the comfortable life he had planned with Melanie. 1 week ago, I had received news that would change everything. News I had kept to myself, processing it alone in the quiet moments when Richard was busy texting Melanie or working late at the office. Information that had transformed me from a woman trying to save her marriage into someone with entirely different priorities. I felt the weight of the envelope hidden between pages 24 and 25 of the album, our trip to Napa Valley 5 years ago. The last vacation where Richard had been fully present, before his phone became a permanent extension of his hand, before Melanie. The envelope pressed against my fingertips, a secret reassurance as I watched Richard check his phone again, clearly, growing impatient with my lack of hysteria. "Is she waiting for you?" I asked, noticing the way his jaw tightened at the question. "Melanie, I mean. Is she downstairs in a taxi, checking the time, wondering what's taking so long?" Richard's expression shifted, surprise briefly flickering across his features before he regained his composure. He hadn't expected me to be so direct about her. In 15 years of marriage, I'd learned to be accommodating, to avoid confrontation, to smooth over difficult moments with compromises. It was exhausting, always being the one to bend. "That's not your concern anymore," he replied, but I caught the quick glance at his watch. For much of our marriage, I'd been the quiet one, the supportive wife who hosted his business dinners, who rearranged her schedule when his plans changed last minute, who slowly set aside her own ambitions to make room for his. My design business, once featured in Seattle Home magazine as one to watch, had dwindled to a handful of loyal clients as Richard's suggestions about my availability became expectations. "You know, you're right," I said, moving toward the leather armchair by the window, my favorite spot in the house, where the morning light made it perfect for sketching. "It isn't my concern." I sat down, placing the album carefully on my lap. Outside, rain had begun to fall, droplets racing down, the window panes in chaotic patterns. Seattle in autumn, perpetually caught between seasons, much like I'd been caught between knowing my marriage was over and admitting it to myself. "I'm glad we understand each other," Richard said, reaching for his phone as it buzzed again. His expression darkened as he read the message. "I need to go. The movers will come for my things next week. I've already told them what's mine." Of course he had. Richard had always been precise about ownership. What was his? What was ours? What was really mine even when it supposedly belonged to both of us. The expensive exercise equipment in the spare room was his. The paintings we'd selected together were his choices, his investments. Even gifts became retroactively his once he decided they had value. "You haven't asked me how I know about Melanie," I said, watching his movements carefully. He paused, hand on the handle of his suitcase. "Does it matter? You obviously figured it out. You're not stupid, Elise, just predictable." That word, predictable, had become his favorite weapon in recent years, a subtle undermining of my creativity, my spontaneity, my worth. I thought about the countless times I'd suggested weekend trips, new restaurants, classes we could take, together, only to have him dismiss them as typical Elise ideas. I'd begun doubting my own instincts, second-guessing choices I would once have made confidently. 7 months ago, I continued, ignoring his attempt to dismiss me. "You started working late on Thursdays. You claimed it was a new client, Westbrook Development." Richard's posture stiffened. He hadn't expected specifics. "Yes, Westbrook is a client. What's your point?" "My point is that Westbrook's CEO is Adam Sullivan. His wife, Claire, has been my client for 3 years. We're redesigning their lake house." I opened the photo album to a page near the middle, pictures from our 10th anniversary trip to Mexico. Hidden behind a photo of us on the beach at sunset was a hotel receipt with an itemized room service order for 2. Champagne, chocolate-covered strawberries, definitely not a business dinner. "Claire mentioned how impressed Adam was that you were willing to have your Thursday meetings at their corporate apartment instead of their offices. Very accommodating of you. She thought it showed exceptional customer service." I closed the album before he could see what I'd revealed. Richard's face had grown pale, a muscle in his jaw working overtime. "You've been spying on me?" he asked, voice lowered to a dangerous octave I recognized from previous arguments, the tone that signaled I should back down, apologize, smooth things over. "Not spying, listening. There's a difference." For months, I'd been quietly gathering information, not just about the affair, but about everything. Richard's spending habits, the mysterious transfers from our joint account to a separate one I couldn't access, the late-night calls that he took in his home office, door firmly closed. It had started as self-preservation, a way to understand what was happening to my marriage. It had become something else entirely. "You had no right to what, Richard? To notice when my husband starts cheating? To pay attention when money disappears from our accounts? To question when the man who criticized my business suddenly has funds for a Patek Philippe watch he hides in his desk drawer?" I hadn't meant to mention the watch, a recent discovery when I was looking for our passport for a trip to see my sister in Portland. He'd canceled at the last minute, claiming budget concerns. The watch had cost more than our mortgage payment. Richard's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. I could almost see his mind working, reassessing the situation, revising. "His strategy? I see," he said, his tone softening into the reasonable, calm voice he used with difficult clients. "You're hurt. I understand that. But going through my things, checking up on me, that's just proving my point, Elise. This is why I need to leave. The trust is gone." The audacity of his statement might have made me laugh if it weren't so painfully typical. Richard had always been gifted at turning situations around, at making his actions seem reasonable, while mine became problematic. It was a talent that had served him well in business and had slowly eroded my self-confidence at home. "When did you decide?" I asked, genuinely curious. "When did you decide our marriage was over?" He sighed, setting his suitcase down, a gesture meant to signal he was giving me his full attention, though his eyes kept darting to his phone. "It wasn't one moment, Elise. We've been growing apart for years. You must have felt it too." The spark was gone. The spark. As if 15 years of building a life together could be reduced to whether or not we still felt butterflies. As if companionship, shared history, Mutual respect counted for nothing when weighed against the excitement of someone new. And Melanie rekindled it? I kept my voice neutral, refusing to give him the emotional outburst he was waiting for. The one that would justify his departure, that would let him tell friends and colleagues his wife had gone crazy when he tried to leave. Melanie understands ambition. She doesn't try to change me or hold me back. She's exciting, vibrant. She's 29, Richard. Of course she's exciting. She hasn't had time to grow tired of your mannerisms or notice how you leave wet towels on the bathroom floor or realize you only call your mother when you want something. His phone buzzed again, the fourth time in as many minutes. Melanie was clearly getting impatient. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, gesturing toward me with frustration. "The bitterness, the resentment. This isn't healthy for either of us." I looked down at the photo album in my lap, at the careful chronology of our years together. The smiling couple in those early photos were almost unrecognizable now. Two people full of hope and plans, unaware of how easily dreams could be rewritten, promises discarded. "You're right about one thing," I said finally. "This isn't healthy. It hasn't been for a long time." Richard nodded, clearly relieved that I was finally seeing his perspective. "I'm glad you understand. We can make this transition smooth if we both stay rational." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied, running my fingers along the edge of the album. "I understand that you've been planning this exit for months while I've been trying to save something that was already gone." What Richard didn't know, couldn't know, was that my own plans had changed dramatically 1 week ago. The news I'd received had shifted everything, giving me clarity I hadn't possessed in years. Suddenly, the subtle manipulations, the gaslighting, the gradual erosion of my confidence, all of it came into sharp focus, like stepping back from a pointillist painting and finally seeing the complete image. Richard glanced at his phone again, his impatience becoming more evident with each passing minute. "Look, I need to go. We can discuss the details later. My lawyer will contact yours." He paused, a small frown creasing his forehead. "You do have a lawyer, right?" The question was deliberately condescending. Throughout our marriage, Richard had handled all our legal matters, insisting it was unnecessary for both of us to waste time on such things. He'd positioned himself as the protector of our interests while systematically ensuring I remained dependent on him for anything involving paperwork, finances, or professional connections. "Actually," I replied, "I do have a lawyer now. Eleanor Vasquez." The name landed like a physical blow. Richard's shoulders tensed, his expression shifting from dismissive to wary in an instant. Eleanor Vasquez wasn't just any attorney. She was the formidable divorce lawyer who had represented the wife of Richard's former business partner, Jonathan. The settlement had been so thorough that Jonathan had been forced to sell his vacation home and move to a smaller office. Richard had called it highway robbery at the time. "Eleanor Vasquez," he repeated slowly. "That's an interesting choice. May I ask why you'd retain counsel before we even discussed separation?" There it was, the familiar pivot, turning my reasonable action into something suspicious while his months of deception remained unremarked upon. I had once apologized for such transgressions, accepting the blame he so readily assigned. "The same reason you've been meeting with Bradley Kent for the past 3 months, I imagine," I replied, mentioning his own attorney. "Preparation." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "How did you— Never mind." He straightened his tie, a nervous habit I'd observed countless times before important meetings. "If that's the direction you want to take this, fine. But understand that I've built most of what we have. My income, my connections." "Our income," I corrected. "Our connections. Washington is a community property state, Richard. Everything acquired during the marriage is subject to equitable distribution, regardless of whose name is on it." His eyebrows rose slightly. I had never challenged him on legal matters before, always deferring to his expertise, his professional knowledge. The shift in dynamics was throwing him off balance, exactly as I had anticipated. "Since when are you an expert on divorce law?" he asked, his tone attempting to reclaim the higher ground. "I'm not. That's why I hired Eleanor." Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. Thunder rolled in the distance, unusual for Seattle this time of year, as if the weather itself were underscoring the tension in our living room. Richard checked his watch again, then sighed dramatically. "I didn't want it to be like this, Elise. I thought we could handle this amicably." "Amicably," I repeated, tasting the word. "Like how you amicably transferred $50,000 from our joint account to your personal one last month? Or how you amicably told the partners at your firm that I was becoming mentally unstable and they shouldn't hire me for the office redesign they were considering?" His face registered genuine shock. "Who told you that?" "Marion Lowell." "We have Pilates together on Tuesdays." Marion was the wife of the senior partner at Richard's firm, a woman he had consistently underestimated and frequently mocked for her social media presence. He had never considered that she and I had developed a friendship independent of him, or that she was fiercely loyal to the women in her circle. Richard ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I knew well. "Marion doesn't understand the nuances of business decisions. The firm needed someone with commercial experience, not residential. It wasn't personal." "It was absolutely personal," I countered. "Just like it was personal when you convinced me to turn down the Seattle Arts Commission project last year because it would take too much time away from our marriage. The marriage you were already planning to leave." Each revelation seemed to physically affect him, like small weights being added to his shoulders. He had not expected this version of me, direct, informed, unswayed by his explanations. For years, I had been the peacekeeper, the one who overlooked inconsistencies, who accepted his framing of events even when they contradicted my own experience. "You're making it sound like I've been plotting against you," he said, his voice taking on the injured tone he used when feeling cornered. "I've supported your work. I introduced you to half your clients, and subtly undermined me to the other half," I added. "Like when you told the Harrisons that my timeline estimates were optimistic, and they should build in some buffer because I tend to underestimate complications. They cut their budget by 20% after that conversation." Richard's phone buzzed yet again. This time the call was displayed on the screen. Mel calling. He declined it with a swift movement, but not before I caught the succession of text notifications above it. "Where the hell are you?" "The driver is charging us waiting time. Dad's going to lose it if we're late for dinner." "Dad. Interesting." I filed that information away, another piece in the puzzle I'd been assembling. "This is pointless," Richard snapped, grabbing his suitcase. "Handle again." "You're clearly determined to paint me as the villain. If that helps you cope with the end of our marriage, fine. But it doesn't change anything. I'm leaving." He moved toward the door, his designer shoes silent on the plush carpet we'd selected together during happier times. The carpet that had cost more than I'd wanted to spend, but that Richard had insisted would elevate the space. One of 1,000 small capitulations I'd made over the years, each one insignificant on its own, devastating in their accumulation. "Before you go," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart, "there's something you should know." He paused, hand on the doorknob, not turning around. "What now, Elise? More accusations? More evidence of my apparent scheming?" "No," I replied, opening the photo album once more, this time to our wedding day. Behind our smiling faces, hands clasped as we faced an uncertain but hopeful future, lay an envelope I'd placed there 3 days ago. It's about why I created this album in the first place. Richard turned slightly, curiosity temporarily overcoming his impatience. The album you made to manipulate me into staying? A bit desperate, wasn't it? The cruel comment hung in the air between us. Time was when such a remark would have cut deep, would have had me questioning my own motivations, wondering if I truly was as pathetic as he suggested. But that was before. Last week, before everything changed. Actually, I said, removing the envelope from its hiding place. I made it for a very specific reason. I needed somewhere safe to keep these documents until the right moment. Documents? Richard turned fully. Now his attention caught despite himself. What documents? I held the sealed envelope carefully, its weight substantial in my hands. Within its confines lay the culmination of months of research, weeks of meetings, and one life-changing phone call 7 days ago. I've been aware of your relationship with Melanie for some time, I began, noting how his expression closed off at her name. I've also been aware of the discrepancies in our finances, the missing funds, the investments you've made without my knowledge or consent. Richard's face hardened into the mask he wore for difficult negotiations. If you're implying I've done something improper, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. I stood, still holding the envelope. 6 months ago, I hired a financial forensic specialist. She's been tracking all activity in our accounts, joint and individual. She's also been monitoring your communications with offshore investment entities. The color drained from Richard's face. You had no right to invade my privacy like that. Any agreements I've made are completely legal? The ones disclosed on our tax returns? Yes, I interrupted. But the Cayman accounts? The shell company in Luxembourg? The transactions routed through your college roommate's consulting firm in Singapore? Those might pose some problems. His suitcase hit the floor with a dull thud. What exactly are you saying, Elise? Thunder cracked overhead. Closer now, the storm moving in with purpose. The symbolic timing wasn't lost on me, nature providing the perfect backdrop for the confrontation. I'd been preparing for far longer than Richard realized. I'm saying that while you were busy planning your new life with Melanie, I was busy too. I kept my voice level, my demeanor calm. And what I discovered changes everything about how our separation will proceed. The envelope in my hands contained more than just financial records. It held the key to my freedom, the evidence of Richard's deception, and most importantly, the proof of what I had discovered exactly 1 week ago. That moment was etched into my memory with crystal clarity, the phone call that had changed everything. I had been in our home office, organizing the design portfolio I'd been rebuilding over the past few months. After years of letting my career take a backseat to Richard's, I had quietly begun reconnecting with former clients, accepting small projects that wouldn't interfere with our life, as Richard would say. It was my private rebellion, a way to reclaim pieces of myself that had slowly eroded during our marriage. The phone had rung at precisely 2:17 p.m., an unknown number with a downtown Seattle area code. Mrs. Elise Montgomery? The voice had asked. Formal and professional. Yes, speaking. This is Devin Williams from Cascade Forensic Accounting. I'm calling regarding the investigation you commissioned. My heart had raced as I closed the office door, even though Richard was at work. Devin had been recommended by Eleanor Vasquez, my newly retained attorney. His specialty was uncovering hidden assets in high-net-worth divorces, though I hadn't yet decided if divorce was my path. At that point, I had simply wanted information, clarity about our financial situation before making any decisions. I have some significant findings to report, Devin had continued. Would you prefer to discuss this in person? No, I had replied, surprising myself with my directness. Please tell me now. What followed was a 43-minute conversation that systematically dismantled every assumption I'd held about our financial life together. Devin had traced a complex network of accounts, investments, and transfers that Richard had kept hidden for years. But the most shocking discovery wasn't the hidden money. It was where some of it had gone. Mrs. Montgomery, Devin had said, his Voice careful, measured. Are you aware that your husband has been making regular payments to a holding company called Phoenix Enterprises since 2018? I wasn't. The name meant nothing to me. Phoenix Enterprises is owned by Gerald Reynolds. According to our research, Mr. Reynolds is Melanie's father, I had finished, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. Gerald Reynolds, Melanie's father. The prominent real estate developer who had mysteriously withdrawn from several major projects 2 years ago, citing personal reasons. The man whose financial troubles had been quietly circulating among Seattle's business elite. Devin had confirmed my suspicion. Yes, it appears your husband has invested approximately $1.4 million in Mr. Reynolds's company over the past 3 years. The funds were diverted from your joint assets through a series of increasingly sophisticated transfers. The revelation had left me breathless. Not just the amount, though $1.4 million was substantial, but the implications. Richard hadn't just been having an affair with Melanie. He had been financially entangled with her family for years, possibly since before she even began working at his firm. Now, standing in our living room with the envelope containing Devin's complete report, I watched Richard's expression shift from defiance to uncertainty. He was recalculating, reassessing, trying to determine exactly how much I knew and how it would affect his carefully constructed exit plan. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice deliberately casual despite the tension evident in his stance. "That I've hidden money? That's a common accusation in divorces, Elise. Very predictable." There was that word again. Predictable. His favorite weapon to diminish me. To suggest I was incapable of surprising him or anyone else. How satisfying it would be to prove him wrong. Not just hidden money, Richard. Misappropriated funds. Specifically, $1.4 million transferred to Phoenix Enterprises. I watched his face carefully as I mentioned the company name. Gerald Reynolds's company, Melanie's father. The blood drained from his face so rapidly I momentarily wondered if he might faint. His hand reached for the back of the sofa, steadying himself. "How did you find out?" I finished for him. "As I said, I hired a forensic accountant. But the real question isn't how I know, it's what I plan to do with the information." Thunder crashed directly overhead, rattling the windows of our home. The storm had arrived in full force, sheets of rain now pounding against the glass. Richard's phone buzzed again, but he didn't even glance at it this time. His focus was entirely on the envelope in my hands and the threat it represented. "Elise," he began, his tone shifting to the conciliatory voice he used with difficult clients. "I can explain everything. The investments in Phoenix were legitimate business opportunities. Gerald had some cash flow issues, yes, but the potential returns justified the risk." I raised an eyebrow. "Returns?" According to Devin's analysis, Phoenix Enterprises has been functionally insolvent since 2019. Every dollar you've put in has essentially disappeared. That's not... He stopped himself, visibly recalibrating his approach. "Look, business investments sometimes don't pan out. That doesn't mean there was anything improper about them." "Except that you never disclose them," I countered. "Not to me, not on our tax returns, not to your firm's ethics committee. 3 separate violations that would interest 3 separate authorities." Richard's breathing had become shallow, his customary composure cracking under the weight of exposure. For the first time in our confrontation, real fear flickered in his eyes. "What exactly do you want, Elise?" he asked quietly. It was the question I had been waiting for, not because I had a list of demands prepared, though I did, but because it represented a fundamental shift in our power dynamic. After 15 years of Richard determining the parameters of our relationship, of my career, of our financial decisions, he was now asking me to set the terms. Initially, I just wanted answers, I said truthfully. I wanted to understand why our marriage had fallen apart, why you'd chosen Melanie, why money kept disappearing from our accounts. I moved to the window, watching the storm transform our carefully landscaped garden into a wild, chaotic space. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Control giving way to natural forces, the illusion of perfect order dissolving under pressure. But what I discovered changed everything, I continued. It wasn't just about the affair. It wasn't even about the money itself. It was about the pattern of deception, Richard. The deliberate, systematic way you've manipulated our finances while making me feel irrational for questioning anything. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his abandoned suitcase by the door. Melanie and her father were waiting, expecting him to arrive with good news, presumably about securing more funds. The dinner meeting mentioned in the texts suddenly made sense in this context. I admit I should have been more transparent, he conceded, though his tone suggested he was making a tactical retreat rather than offering a genuine apology. The investments in Phoenix were complicated. I didn't want to worry you with the details. Complicated, I repeated. Is that what we're calling it? Because Devin used different terms. Terms like fraudulent transfers and misappropriation of joint assets. Terms that have legal consequences, Richard. I returned to the sofa, sitting down with the photo album in my lap once more. The familiar weight of it was oddly comforting, a physical representation of the history between us. Both, the genuine love that had once existed and the elaborate deceptions that had replaced it. 1 week ago, I said, opening the album to the final page, Devin called to tell me he'd completed his investigation. He found something even more significant than the Phoenix investments. Richard's face had gone completely pale now, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool air in our living room. What are you talking about? His voice had lost its smooth confidence, replaced by a raspy uncertainty. I pulled out a second document from the back of the album, a legal-looking paper with the letterhead of Richards, Yamamoto and Klein, his law firm. 3 months ago, you restructured your partnership agreement at the firm, I said, watching his expression carefully. You converted a significant portion of your equity to cash and transferred it to a private account under your name only. His eyes widened slightly, confirmation that my information was accurate. That's a routine business transaction, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Partners restructure their equity positions all the time. Perhaps, I agreed. But typically they don't do it while simultaneously applying for a new position at Harper & Wolcott in New York, the direct competitor of their current firm. Or while transferring company clients to that competitor in exchange for a signing bonus. The final piece of information landed like a physical blow. Richard actually staggered slightly, reaching for the wall to steady himself. How could you possibly know that? He whispered. The look of absolute shock on Richard's face was something I would remember for years to come. In all our time together, I had never seen him so completely blindsided, so utterly stripped of his carefully cultivated control. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of guilt, not for discovering his deception, but for the small part of me that was enjoying his distress. Your firm doesn't know yet, I said, answering the question he hadn't verbalized. About Harper and Wolcott, I mean. They suspect something, of course. Marcus Yamamoto has been particularly concerned about your recent behavior. Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of his senior partner's name. Marcus had been Richard's mentor when he first joined the firm, the man who had championed his advancement to partner. The betrayal would be personal for him. You've been talking to Marcus? Richard's voice was strained, the implications clearly overwhelming him. Since when are you and Marcus in contact? Since his wife Judith commissioned me to redesign their lake house in March. I allowed myself a small smile. You remember, the project you told me was too small to bother with when I mentioned the referral? Judith and I have become quite close. It was true. What had begun as a professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship. Judith Yamamoto, 20 years my senior and infinitely wiser about the politics of Seattle's interconnected business world, had become an unexpected ally and confidant. "Judith talks too much," Richard muttered, running his hand through his hair again. "Always has. She mentioned you've been canceling partnership meetings, that you've been unreachable when certain clients call, that files have gone missing from the firm's secure server." I kept my voice even, factual. She didn't connect the dots, but Devin did. "The timing aligned perfectly with your correspondence with Harper and Wolcott." Richard's phone buzzed again. This time, the screen displayed, "Gerald calling." Melanie's father was becoming impatient too. "This is absurd," Richard said, though his protest lacked conviction. "You've been spying on me, constructing some elaborate conspiracy theory." "Not a theory," I corrected, removing another document from the album. "This is the offer letter from Harper and Wolcott dated 6 weeks ago. You accepted it 4 weeks ago. You're scheduled to start on the 1st of next month." I held up the paper, watching as recognition flashed across his features. The letterhead was unmistakable, as was the signature of Christine Harper, the notoriously selective managing partner of New York's most aggressive corporate law firm. "Where did you get that?" Richard whispered, his composure completely shattered. "Now, that was in my private email? The account you access only from your laptop?" I nodded. Yes, it was. 3 months ago, such an invasion of privacy would have been unthinkable to me. I had always respected Richard's boundaries, his need for professional space. But that was before Devin's initial findings, before the evidence of financial deception had become impossible to ignore. Before I had realized that my trusting nature had been weaponized against me for years. "Eleanor advised me to document everything," I explained, referring to my attorney. "She suggested I might need leverage in case the divorce became contentious." "She didn't expect me to find evidence of corporate espionage," Richard flinched at the term. "It's not espionage, it's normal career advancement. Is that what Harper and Wolcott thinks they're getting? Normal career advancement?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. "Or do they think they're getting Richard's, Yamamoto and Klein's client list and proprietary strategies? Because according to the emails you exchanged with Christine Harper, you promised to bring over at least 4 major clients within the first quarter. Clients who legally belong to the partnership, not to Richard individually. Clients whose information was protected by confidentiality agreements that Richard had apparently been violating for months. You don't understand how these things work," Richard said, attempting to regain his authoritative tone. "Clients follow attorneys they trust. It's standard practice." "Secretly copying confidential files isn't standard practice," I countered. "Neither is accessing the firm's client billing system after hours to collect contact information you're not authorized to have." Richard's face went from pale to ashen. That detail, about the late-night access to the billing system, had come from Marcus himself, who had mentioned it to Judith, who had shared it with me during one of our design consultations. The significance hadn't registered until Devin had uncovered the connection to Harper and Wolcott. "You've been planning this for months," I continued, gesturing to his suitcase. "The move to New York with Melanie, the position at Harper and Wolcott, the client transfers. That would guarantee your success there, all while siphoning our joint assets to rescue her father from financial ruin." Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the room in stark white light. Richard stood motionless, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. "What do you want?" he asked again, this time with resignation in his voice. I had spent the week since Devin's call considering this very question. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Financial security? A clean break from the man who had systematically undermined my confidence while betraying me in ways I was only beginning to comprehend? "Initially, I wanted a fair divorce," I said truthfully. "An equitable division of assets, a reasonable process. Even after I discovered the affair, that was still my goal." I closed the photo album, running my fingers over its leather cover one last time. Within its pages lay the chronology of our relationship, the happy beginning, the gradual deterioration, the final betrayal, all meticulously documented like the designer I was trained to be. But then I found out about Phoenix Enterprises and Harper and Wolcott, and suddenly, fair took on a new meaning. Richard's phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. The screen displayed multiple notifications now, texts from both Melanie and her father, their patience clearly exhausted. Whatever plans they had for the evening were time-sensitive. "I could destroy you, Richard," I said quietly, the realization of my power both exhilarating and terrifying. One phone call to Marcus with what I know about Harper and Wolcott, another to the Washington State Bar Association about the ethical violations, a third to the IRS about the undisclosed offshore accounts. His face contorted with a mixture of fear and anger. "You wouldn't." "A week ago, I might not have," I admitted. "I might have still believed there was something worth salvaging, if not our marriage, then at least the memory of what we once meant to each other." I stood, moving to the fireplace where our wedding portrait had stood until Richard had quietly removed it 3 months ago, claiming he was having it reframed as a surprise. Another lie in a tapestry of deception so intricate I was only now beginning to see its full pattern. But that was before I understood the extent of your betrayal. Before I realized that while I was trying to save our marriage, you were systematically dismantling our financial security and your professional ethics. The rain continued to pound against the windows, the storm showing no signs of abating. It was as if nature itself was underlining the gravity of the moment, the irreversible shift occurring between us. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice steady despite the churning emotions beneath. "You're going to call Melanie and her father and tell them you can't make it tonight. You're going to tell them the deal is off. Then you're going to call Marcus and request an emergency partners meeting for tomorrow morning." Richard's expression hardened. "And why would I do any of that?" "Because the alternative is that I call them first," I replied simply. "I call Marcus and explain exactly what I've discovered. I call the Bar Association with evidence of your ethical violations. I call Harper and Wolcott and inform them that their new hire is about to be at the center of a major legal and ethical scandal." I watched as the implications registered on his face as he calculated his options and found them severely limited. The man who had spent years convincing me that I was the one with limited choices, with constrained options, was now experiencing the same restriction himself. "You've been planning this," he said, a note of grudging admiration mixing with his anger. "All of it. The album, the evidence, the timing." "I learned from the best," I replied, allowing a hint of irony into my tone. "You always said I needed to be more strategic, more forward-thinking. Consider this my final exam." Outside, a car horn sounded, brief, impatient. Through the rain-streaked window, I could make out the silhouette of a luxury sedan idling at the curb. Melanie had apparently decided to come retrieve him herself. "They're waiting for you," I observed. "Your future, your escape plan, everything you've been working toward." Richard glanced toward the window, then back at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might simply walk out, might choose the path he'd been planning despite the consequences I'd outlined. Part of me almost hoped he would. It would make what came next even easier to justify. "What happens if I do what you're asking?" he finally asked. "If I call off the deal with Gerald, if I come clean to the firm, what then?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the one I'd rehearsed answering in front of my bathroom mirror for the past week. Not because I was uncertain about my response, but because I wanted to deliver it with exactly the right tone, not vindictive, not emotional, but clear and unequivocal. "Then we proceed with a divorce that acknowledges the full extent of our marital assets, including those you've attempted to hide. You retain your position at the firm, though I imagine there will be consequences for the actions they discover. You make restitution for the funds diverted to Phoenix Enterprises, and we never have to see each other again. And if I refuse? I picked up my phone from the side table where it had been sitting, screen dark, throughout our conversation. Unlike Richard, I hadn't been distracted by messages or calls. I had been fully present for this confrontation. This moment I had been planning for months. Then I make the calls, all of them. Tonight. The simplicity of the statement hung between us. No melodrama, no threats beyond the reality of his own actions being exposed. Just the clear consequence of the choice before him. Richard's phone buzzed. Again. He glanced at it, then back at me, his expression now calculating. I could almost see his mind working, looking for angles, for leverage, for some way to regain control of the situation. You know, he said slowly, there's another option. Here, one you haven't considered. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. This was the moment I had anticipated, when Richard would attempt to flip the script, to reframe the narrative in a way that benefited him. He had always been skilled at finding 11th-hour solutions that somehow left him in a stronger position. We could start over, he suggested, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he reserved for his most important negotiations. Clean slate, full disclosure from now on. I'll end things with Melanie, come clean about the Harper and Wolcott offer, work things out with the firm. We've built 15 years together, Elise. Do we really want to throw that away? I studied his face, the face I had loved, had trusted, had built a life around. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to imagine the scenario he proposed. Reconciliation, rebuilding, a marriage resurrected from the ashes of betrayal. But the moment passed quickly, reality reasserting itself with the clarity that had become my companion this past week. The man standing before me wasn't offering reconciliation. He was offering another performance, another manipulation designed to protect himself at my expense. That might have worked a year ago, I said softly. Even 6 months ago, I might have believed you. But not now. Not after everything I've discovered. I held up the photo album one last time. The symbolic record of our shared history, now transformed into evidence of its dissolution. Your things will be packed and stored by the end of the week, I stated calmly. The house will be listed for sale next month. Eleanor will contact your attorney with the proposed settlement agreement tomorrow. Richard's face hardened. The brief vulnerability of his reconciliation offer vanishing beneath the familiar mask of control. You think you've won, he said, his voice cold. That you've outmaneuvered me. But you have no idea what you're getting into, Elise. Legal battles, financial complications. It could take years. Is that really what you want? Years of your life. Consumed by fighting me? Fighting you was never my goal, Richard, I replied, surprised by the genuine calm in my voice. That's the difference between us. You've been planning a battle. I've been planning an exit. His threat hung in the air. Between us. Years of legal complications, financial disputes, the prolonged agony of a contested divorce. A year ago, even 6 months ago, such a prospect would have terrified me into compliance. The Richard Montgomery legal machine versus the wife who had allowed her career to dwindle to accommodate his. It would have seemed like no contest at all. And here I thought you'd become strategic, he said with a dismissive wave. You still don't understand how these things work. One phone call from me to Bradley Kent, and your little plan falls apart. He'll tie up every asset we have in litigation. So complex it'll make your head spin. Bradley Kent, Richard's attorney and golf partner. The man he'd referred to as the divorce destroyer when a colleague had gone through a contentious separation last year. I remembered Richard recounting Kent's tactics with admiration over dinner. How he'd managed to hide assets, delay proceedings, exhaust the opposing party both financially and emotionally until they settled for far less than they deserved. Bradley Kent, I repeated thoughtfully. Yes, he does have quite the reputation. Richard's smile was cold, confident. He believed he had reclaimed the upper hand by reminding me of the powerful allies at his disposal. Exactly. So perhaps we should reconsider the terms of our separation. Something more favorable to both parties. Outside, the car horn sounded. Again, more insistent this time. The sedan's headlights flashed twice, cutting through the rain-streaked darkness. Melanie was clearly reaching the limits of her patience. You should probably let her know you'll be a bit longer, I suggested, my tone conversational. This might take a while. Richard glanced toward the window, irritation flashing across his features. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message, his thumbs moving with practiced efficiency. As he did, I walked to the sideboard where a crystal decanter of his favorite whiskey sat, an anniversary gift from 3 years ago when I was still trying to find ways to please him, to rekindle what we had lost. Drink? I offered, holding up the decanter. He looked surprised by the gesture. Sure, why not? I poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid into a crystal tumbler, another expensive purchase he had insisted on, and handed it to him. I didn't pour. One for myself. I needed complete clarity for what came next. Now, about Bradley Kent, I said as Richard took a sip of his whiskey. You're right that he's very good at what he does. Ruthless, creative, effective. Richard nodded, seemingly pleased. That I was acknowledging the strength of his position. The whiskey appeared to be having its intended effect, restoring some of his customary confidence. But there's something you should know about Bradley, I continued. Something relevant to our current situation. Richard's expression shifted subtly. Wariness, creeping back into his eyes. And what would that be? Bradley Kent is no longer practicing family law, I stated simply. As of 2 weeks ago, he's been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation by the Washington State Bar Association. The whiskey glass froze halfway to Richard's lips. What are you talking about? I walked to the photo album again, this time turning to a page near the end. Our trip to Vancouver 3 years ago. Behind a smiling selfie of us against the harbor. Backdrop, I removed a newspaper clipping from the Seattle Legal Times. The headline read, Prominent Divorce Attorney Faces Ethics Investigation. It seems Bradley has been engaging in some questionable billing practices, I explained, holding up the article. Charging multiple clients for the same hours, inflating expenses, pressuring vulnerable clients into unnecessary litigation to increase fees, the usual abuses of power, but on a scale that finally attracted attention. Richard snatched the article from my hand, scanning it with disbelief. This could be nothing. Accusations get made all the time. True, I acknowledged. But in this case, the accusations come with substantial evidence, including testimony from his former paralegal, Vanessa Chen. Richard's head snapped up at the name. Vanessa? But she's been with Bradley for years. 8 years, to be precise. Long enough to document a pattern of behavior that the Bar Association found impossible to ignore. I paused, watching comprehension dawn on his face. She's also Judith Yamamoto's niece. Small world, isn't it? The connections that Richard had long leveraged to his advantage, the tightly woven network of Seattle's legal and business communities, were now working against him. The same social fabric that had elevated him was unraveling his carefully constructed safety net. This doesn't change anything, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. There are other attorneys, better ones. Of course there are, I agreed. But they'll need to be brought up to speed, and they'll need to be paid retainers, substantial ones given the complexity of our situation. I nodded toward his phone, which had begun buzzing again with incoming messages. And it seems like your financial situation might be more precarious than you've let on. Gerald Reynolds appears quite anxious about something. A dinner meeting with an investor, perhaps? Someone who was expecting you to bring good news about additional funding? Richard's expression confirmed my suspicion. The dinner wasn't just a social obligation. It was a financial necessity. Gerald Reynolds needed money, and Richard had promised to deliver it. Money that would likely have come from our joint assets, siphoned through the same channels Devon had already identified. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. "There are commitments, arrangements that depended on my continued ignorance," I finished for him. "On my remaining the convenient, compliant wife who never questioned where the money went, or why our accounts never seemed to grow despite your supposedly successful career." I moved to the window, looking out at the waiting car. Through the rain, I could make out Melanie's silhouette in the back seat, the glow of her phone illuminating her features as she typed furiously, probably sending the messages that kept making Richard's phone buzz. "It's interesting," I mused, "how quickly 15 years of marriage becomes an inconvenient obstacle when something shinier comes along. Or someone, in this case." Richard drained his whiskey in a single swallow, setting the empty glass down with more force than necessary. "Don't pretend this is about hurt feelings, Elise. If you go through with this, if you expose me to the firm, to the bar association, you'll be cutting off your own support. The lifestyle you've grown accustomed to will disappear overnight." It was his final card. Financial intimidation. The implicit threat that had kept me quiet, compliant, and uncertain for years. The fear of losing everything if I dared to challenge him. "That might have worked before," I acknowledged. "But there's something you don't know, Richard. Something that changes everything." His expression shifted, wariness returning. "What now? Another revelation from your little investigation?" "In a way," I said, moving back to the photo album. "But this one didn't come from Devon or Eleanor or any of the other professionals I've consulted." I turned to the very last page of the album, blank, except for a single business card taped to the center. A simple white card with elegant black lettering. "Westlake Design Group." Richard glanced at it with confusion. "Your dormant business? What does that have to do with anything?" "Not dormant anymore," I corrected. "And not just mine. As of last Monday, Westlake Design Group is a partnership. Judith Yamamoto and I have combined our resources and contacts to create a full-service interior architecture firm." The information clearly caught him off guard. "Judith? But she's not even a designer. She's just Marcus's wife." His dismissive tone, the automatic devaluation of Judith to merely an extension of her husband, was so characteristic that it almost made me smile. Richard had always categorized the women in his world this way, as accessories to the men he considered important, not as independent entities with their own agency and capabilities. "Judith has an MBA from Wharton and 20 years of experience managing commercial real estate developments," I informed him. "She's also been looking for a creative partnership since she stepped back from her executive role at Pacific Northwest Properties." I removed the business card from the album and held it up between us. "While you've been planning your escape with Melanie, I've been rebuilding my professional identity, reconnecting with former clients, establishing new contacts, creating something that exists independently of you and our marriage." Richard stared at the card, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. "This is what you've been doing all those evenings you claimed to be working on the photo album? Starting a business behind my back?" The irony of his indignation, his outrage at my supposed deception while he had been systematically betraying me for months, was almost comical. In another context, I might have laughed. "The album was real," I said instead. "Just multi-purpose, a record of our history together and a secure place to store the evidence of its ending. Efficient design has always been my specialty." Richard's phone began buzzing incessantly now, a cascade of notifications that suggested both Melanie and her father had moved beyond impatience into genuine panic. Whatever meeting they were scheduled to attend must have been critically important. I watched as he glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening at what he saw. "I need to take this," he said, gesturing toward his phone. "By all means," I replied, gesturing toward the kitchen. You can have some privacy in there. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave me alone with the evidence I'd collected, but the persistent buzzing demanded his attention. With a final warning glance, he strode into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. I could hear the low murmur of his voice, the practiced calm he employed when attempting to manage a difficult situation. I'd heard that tone countless times over the years, when soothing anxious clients, when explaining away discrepancies in our bank accounts, when placating his mother during her occasional inquiries about grandchildren. While he was occupied, I moved to the sideboard where I'd placed a slim portfolio earlier that day. Inside were additional copies of every document hidden in the photo album, plus several that Richard had not yet seen. Insurance against any attempt he might make to destroy the evidence I'd gathered. I had just closed the portfolio when Richard emerged from the kitchen, his complexion now ashen. Whatever conversation had transpired had clearly not gone well. Problems? I inquired mildly. Nothing that concerns you, he snapped, though the tremor in his voice belied his attempt at dismissiveness. Let me guess, I said, sitting down on the sofa again. Gerald Reynolds is facing some kind of deadline. A loan payment, perhaps? Or an investor who's threatening to pull out if additional capital isn't secured tonight. Richard's eyes narrowed. You don't know what you're talking about. Actually, I do. I opened the photo album once more, this time to a page featuring a charity gala we'd attended 2 years ago. Behind the formal photo of us in evening wear, I removed a financial statement. Phoenix Enterprises has a balloon payment of $2.4 million due to Cascade Investment Trust tomorrow morning. Given Gerald's current cash flow issues, I'm guessing he was counting on you to provide a significant portion of that amount. Richard's face registered genuine shock. How could you possibly know that? Cascade Investment Trust is owned by Howard Lowell, I explained. Marion Lowell's brother-in-law. When I mentioned Gerald Reynolds' financial troubles to her over lunch last week, she was quite forthcoming about the loan her family's trust had extended to him. I hadn't actually known about the balloon payment specifically, but Richard's reaction confirmed my educated guess. The Seattle business community was indeed a small world, especially when one began actively engaging with it rather than remaining on its periphery as Richard had always encouraged me to do. This is none of your business, Richard insisted, though his commanding tone had been replaced by something closer to desperation. What happens between Gerald and his investors has nothing to do with us. It does when you're planning to use our joint assets to bail him out, I countered. Assets that, incidentally, you have no legal right to allocate without my consent. Richard ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture that had become more frequent as our confrontation progressed. You don't understand the complexity of the situation. Gerald's company has tremendous potential. The current cash flow issues are temporary. Temporary, I repeated. Like the $1.4 million you've already invested? Has any of that been returned? Yet? His silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, I continued. And now Gerald needs even more to satisfy his creditors. How much were you planning to give him tonight, Richard? Another $1 million? 2? How deep does this hole actually go? Richard moved to the sidebar and poured himself another whiskey, larger this time. His hand trembled slightly as he raised the glass to his lips. Gerald has connections, opportunities. The Phoenix investment is strategic, not just financial. Strategic? For whom? I asked. For you and Melanie? For your new life together in New York? He didn't answer directly, but his expression confirmed my suspicion. Gerald Reynolds' business troubles weren't just a financial concern. They were a potential obstacle to Richard's planned future with Melanie. A future that apparently required Gerald to remain financially solvent, maintaining whatever connections and opportunities Richard believed would benefit his new life. Let me share something with you, Richard, I said, keeping my voice level. Something I learned during my consultations with Eleanor Vasquez. I removed another document from the photo album, this one from our honeymoon in Italy. The paper was official-looking, with the letterhead of the Washington State Department of Financial Institutions. Phoenix Enterprises is currently under preliminary investigation by state regulators, I explained, watching his expression carefully. Their business model has raised red flags, particularly the pattern of private investments from individuals, with personal connections to Gerald, followed by guaranteed returns that initially appear impressive, but eventually stop materializing. Richard's face went from ashen to gray. You're making that up. Am I? I held up the document. Eleanor has a contact at the DFI. When I mentioned Gerald Reynolds and the investments you'd been making, she made some inquiries. The investigation is still confidential, but it's very real. And it's gaining momentum. I let the information sink in before delivering the final blow. In fact, the DFI is particularly interested in a dinner meeting scheduled for tonight between Gerald and a potential new investor. Someone who might be bringing significant capital to the table right before that balloon payment comes due. The glass nearly slipped from Richard's hand. How could you possibly know about that meeting? I didn't, I admitted. Not until you confirmed it just now. But it makes sense. Gerald needs money immediately. He's been telling you how crucial tonight's meeting is, and you've been promising to deliver something, or someone, that would solve his problems. Richard set his glass down carefully, his legal training finally reasserting itself. This is all speculation. You have no actual evidence that anything improper is occurring. Perhaps not conclusive evidence, I agreed, but enough to warrant further investigation by the appropriate authorities, especially when combined with the unusual financial transfers from our accounts to offshore entities, and then to Phoenix. Devin documented the entire trail, Richard. Every transaction, every attempt at obscuring the source. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time he ignored it completely, his focus entirely on me and the threat I now represented. Not just to his relationship with Melanie, but to his professional standing, his financial security, and potentially even his freedom if Gerald's business ventures crossed the line from questionable to fraudulent. What exactly do you want, Elise? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the third time he'd asked that question tonight, but the first time he'd asked it with genuine fear rather than calculation or resignation. The power dynamic between us had shifted completely. The reversal so dramatic it was almost dizzying. I told you before, I replied calmly. A clean break, a fair division of assets, my freedom from a marriage that has become a prison of manipulation and deceit. I closed the photo album for the final time, the symbolic gesture not lost on either of us. But now I want something else as well. Something that wasn't part of my original plan. Richard waited, tension visible in every line of his body. I want you to call Gerald right now, I said, and tell him you won't be coming tonight. That there is no new investor, that you can't provide any additional funds, that whatever plan you had to solve his financial crisis is no longer viable. That would destroy him, Richard protested. The balloon payment is his problem, not yours, I interrupted. And certainly not mine. Whatever arrangement you had with Gerald, whatever you promised him in exchange for his daughter or his connections or his supposed opportunities, it ends tonight. I stood, gathering the portfolio containing my copies of the evidence. Make the call, Richard, now, on speakerphone, so I can hear both sides of the conversation. And if I refuse, then I make my own calls, I replied simply. To Marcus Yamamoto, about Harper and Wolcott. To the DFI about Phoenix Enterprises. To the Bar Association about the ethical violations. All tonight, before you have a chance to create any counter-narrative. Outside, the car horn sounded again. A long, sustained blast of frustration and impatience. Melanie was clearly at the end of her rope, her carefully planned evening unraveling just as Richard's carefully constructed exit strategy was collapsing. Richard looked from me to his phone, then back again. For a moment, I thought he might still try to find some way out, some angle I hadn't considered, some loophole in the trap I'd constructed around him. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining from him as he accepted the inevitability of his defeat. "Fine," he said, his voice hollow. "I'll make the call." He picked up his phone, scrolled to Gerald's contact, and pressed the speaker button. The sound of ringing filled our living room, each tone marking another nail in the coffin of Richard's plans. "Richard! Where the hell are you?" Gerald's voice exploded from the speaker, tense and angry. "We've been waiting for over an hour. The investor is threatening to leave." "There is no investor, Gerald," Richard replied, his eyes locked on mine, as he delivered the fatal blow to whatever scheme they had concocted. "And there won't be any more money from me. Not tonight. Not ever." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the rain against the windows, the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, the faint sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. "What are you talking about?" Gerald finally responded, his voice dangerously quiet. "This isn't funny, Richard. We have commitments, arrangements, people expecting results." "The arrangements have changed," Richard stated flatly. "I can't help you anymore. You'll need to find another solution to your financial problems." "Is this some kind of negotiating tactic?" Gerald demanded, his voice rising again. "Because if you think you can leverage my situation to get a better deal..." "It's not a tactic," Richard interrupted. "It's over, Gerald. All of it. Tell Melanie I won't be joining her in New York either." Before Gerald could respond, Richard ended the call, his finger pressing the disconnect button with finality. For a moment, we stood in silence, the rain providing a steady backdrop to the dramatic conclusion of Richard's carefully orchestrated escape plan. "Satisfied?" he asked, his voice bitter. "Not yet," I replied. "But it's a start." Outside, the car door slammed. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see Melanie emerging from the sedan, her slim figure hunched against the downpour as she marched toward our front door. Her determination was evident even through the distortion of rain and darkness. She was coming to retrieve Richard herself. "You should probably handle that," I suggested, gesturing toward the door where Melanie would soon be demanding entry. "This conversation doesn't need an audience." Richard glanced toward the window, conflict evident on his face. The carefully constructed world he had built was collapsing around him in real time. His escape plan with Melanie now compromised, his professional future uncertain, his financial schemes exposed. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The doorbell rang, an insistent, prolonged press that echoed through our home. Neither of us moved to answer it. "Now we negotiate the terms of our separation," I replied calmly. "But not tonight. Tonight, you need to deal with the immediate consequences of your choices." I gathered the photo album and my portfolio of evidence, holding them close to my chest like the shields they had become. "I'll be staying at the Fairmont Olympic tonight. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., you'll meet with Marcus Yamamoto and explain your communications with Harper and Wolcott. You'll disclose the client information you've shared and the plans you made to transfer their business." "That will destroy my career," Richard protested, though his objection sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You did that yourself," I corrected him. "I'm just ensuring you face the consequences rather than shifting them to innocent parties." The doorbell rang again, followed immediately by aggressive knocking. Melanie's patience had clearly run out. "After your meeting with Marcus, you'll call Eleanor Vasquez's office to schedule a discussion about our divorce settlement," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil beneath. "You'll be completely transparent about all assets, including those you've attempted to hide offshore. You'll agree to an equitable division that acknowledges my contributions to our marriage and compensates for the funds you diverted to Phoenix Enterprises." Richard's phone began ringing, Melanie calling now in addition to her assault on our front door. He silenced it without looking away from me. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though the question lacked conviction. We both knew he had run out of options. "Then the portfolio I'm holding goes to Marcus, to the Bar Association, to the DFI, and to the IRS," I replied simply. "I've prepared copies for each of them, with specific cover letters highlighting the portions most relevant to their respective interests." I moved toward the hallway that led to our bedroom, the room we had shared for 15 years, that I had redecorated 3 times in futile attempts to revitalize our relationship, that now felt like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer existed. "Answer the door, Richard," I advised. "Explain to Melanie that your plans have changed, then pack what you need for tonight and leave. When you return tomorrow, I'll be gone." The knocking had become pounding now, Melanie's voice audible through the heavy wood of our front door. "Richard, I know you're in there. Open the door." He looked from the door to me, indecision paralyzing him momentarily. "This isn't over, Elise." "Yes." "Richard," I replied, a strange sense of peace settling over me despite the chaos of the moment. "It is." I turned and walked down the hallway, the weight of the album and portfolio in my arms, a tangible reminder of all I had discovered. All I had survived, all I had reclaimed. Behind me, I heard Richard finally moving to open the door, to face at least one consequence of his elaborate deception. In our bedroom, I efficiently packed the essentials I would need for the next few days: clothes, toiletries, the business documents for Westlake Design Group, my laptop. The room that had once been our shared sanctuary now felt like a space I was merely visiting, its familiarity already fading as I prepared to leave it behind. Through the closed door, I could hear the muffled sounds of Richard and Melanie arguing, her voice rising in incredulous anger, his attempting to maintain control of a situation long past controlling. Their drama felt distant, disconnected from me, as if I were watching a play I had already seen and knew the ending to. I zipped my overnight bag and took one final look around the room. On the dresser sat a framed photo from our wedding day. Richard, and I laughing under an arbor of white roses, my hand on his chest, his arm around my waist, both of us gazing into a future we believed would unfold together. I deliberately left it behind, a relic of a life I was no longer obligated to preserve. With my bag in one hand and my evidence in the other, I walked back down the hallway, emerging into the living room where Richard and Melanie were engaged. In what appeared to be an increasingly heated confrontation, they both fell silent as I entered, Melanie's eyes narrowing as she recognized me. "So, this is why we're missing our meeting," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. A last-minute domestic drama. At 29, Melanie Reynolds was everything. Richard had accused me of no longer being young, ambitious, uncomplicated by the compromises and disappointments that accumulate over 15 years of marriage. Her designer dress and perfectly styled hair presented the polished image he had come to prefer, the shiny exterior that masked whatever substance might lie beneath. "Good evening, Melanie," I replied calmly. "I believe Richard has some news for you about your plans." I walked past them toward the front door, pausing only to collect my coat and purse from the entryway closet. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, the storm moving on just as I was preparing to do the same. "You're making a mistake," Richard called after me, a hint of his old authority returning to his voice. "Without me, you'll never maintain this lifestyle. This house, the vacations, the social connections, all of it disappears once you walk out that door." I turned back to face him one last time, struck by how small he suddenly appeared, how diminished without the power I had allowed him to wield over me for so long. "I don't need this lifestyle, Richard," I said simply. "I never did. That was your priority, not mine." I opened the front door, the cool evening air carrying the clean scent of rain-washed streets and new possibilities. "I've already maintained the only things that truly matter: my dignity, my integrity, and my future. Everything else is just furniture," Without waiting for his response, I stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind me. In the driveway, the hired sedan still idled, its driver looking confused at the unexpected turn of events. Beyond it, the lights of Seattle glimmered against the clearing sky, the city stretching out before me like an unexplored territory. I walked to my own car, the modest Volvo Richard had always criticized as beneath our status, and placed my belongings carefully in the passenger seat. As I slid behind the wheel, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. A woman I barely recognized, with clear eyes and a determined set to her jaw. A woman who had finally reclaimed her story. 1 year later. The morning light streamed through the windows of my downtown office, illuminating the drafting table where I'd spent the previous 3 hours finalizing designs for our newest client. Boutique hotel overlooking Puget Sound that had specifically requested Westlake Design Group for their complete interior renovation. "Those look fantastic," Judith commented, entering with 2 cups of coffee and setting one beside my sketches. At 62, Judith Yamamoto brought a wealth of business experience and connections to our partnership, complementing my design expertise in ways that had transformed Westlake from a struggling solo practice to one of Seattle's most sought-after design firms. "Thanks," I replied, taking a grateful sip of the coffee. "I think we've finally got the balance right between luxury and sustainability." Judith nodded, studying the renderings with an expert eye. "The Sorensen Group will love it. This could lead to their entire hotel chain if we nail the execution." She settled into the chair opposite my desk, her elegant gray bob catching the light as she tilted her head. "By the way, did you see the article in this morning's business section?" I shook my head, having been absorbed in design work since arriving at the office at dawn. "What article?" Judith slid a folded newspaper across the desk, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Page 3. I thought you might find it interesting." I opened the paper to the indicated page, where a headline immediately caught my attention. "Reynolds Enterprises files for Chapter 11, amid fraud allegations." Beneath the headline was a photo of Gerald Reynolds being escorted from his offices by federal agents, his expression a mixture of defiance and defeat. The article detailed the collapse of his business empire following an extensive investigation by state and federal authorities into what was being described as a sophisticated investment scheme designed to defraud private investors. Apparently, several prominent Seattle professionals were caught up in the scheme, Judith noted, watching me carefully, including a former partner at Richards, Yamamoto & Klein. I set the paper down, absorbing the information with a strange sense of detachment. In the year since I had walked out of my marriage, Richard's name had gradually faded from my daily thoughts, becoming little more than an occasional reference point in my new life. A lesson learned, a chapter closed. "Have you heard anything from Marcus about Richard's current situation?" I asked, curiosity rather than concern prompting the question. Judith sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Last I heard, he was working for a small firm in Portland. Nothing like the position he'd held here or the one he'd arranged in New York. Melanie left him about 3 months after everything fell apart. Apparently, she's engaged to a tech executive now." I nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret at the news. Richard's life, like Gerald's business dealings and Melanie's romantic choices, had become storylines in someone else's narrative. Interesting, perhaps, but no longer relevant to my own. "And how about you?" Judith asked, her tone gentler now. "Any regrets about how things turned out?" I considered the question seriously, looking around the sun-filled office with its view of Elliott Bay, thinking about the thriving business we had built together, the creative freedom I now enjoyed, the genuine friendships I had cultivated once freed from Richard's subtle isolation tactics. "The only regret I have," I answered honestly, "is that I waited so long to value myself enough to leave." Judith nodded in understanding, having walked a similar path in her own life years before. "Well, I, for one, am grateful you finally did. Westlake wouldn't exist without your courage that night. She raised her coffee cup in a small toast. To photo albums that reveal more than just memories. I smiled, thinking of the leather-bound album that had played such a pivotal role in my liberation. After the divorce was finalized, I had donated it to a local women's shelter for use in their financial literacy program, a visual aid to remind women of the importance of maintaining their independence, even within the context of partnership. To revealing what matters, I responded, raising my own cup to meet hers. Outside my office window, Seattle continued its morning routine. Ferries crossing the Sound, people hurrying to meetings, life unfolding in all its complex, imperfect beauty. And for perhaps the first time since I had walked out of my former home on that rainy night a year ago, I felt not just free or independent or professionally fulfilled, but genuinely, unexpectedly happy. Richard had once called me pathetic for creating a photo album to commemorate our years together. He couldn't have known that in doing so, I was actually documenting my path to freedom, preserving evidence not just of what had been, but of what would never be allowed to happen again. I turned back to my design sketches, to the creative work that had once been marginalized, but now formed the center of my reclaimed life. The story of Richard and Melanie and Gerald Reynolds would continue without me, their choices and consequences unfolding according to their own decisions. My story, however, was entirely my own now, and I was finally the one holding the pen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.